Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to this conversation about the state of transatlantic cooperation and technology and trade policy. I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm the president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis here in Washington, D.C. And I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this discussion with our partners, the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and its president, Robert Atkinson, who's going to be coming in here shortly. From my end, from CEPA's end, we're an organization that is committed to building a enduring and strong transatlantic alliance. And of course, technology is center stage of that alliance in the 21st century. We have a large amount of information now about what the EU has been doing on tech regulation and trade in particular. The United States has been taking specific actions, most notably the IRA and the CHIPS Act. And we want to have this conversation ahead of the fourth meeting of the Trade and Tech Council that will be taking place in just a short period of time, about a month here, to really try to understand where we align, how much we align between Europe and the US, and what are the challenges and obstacles that we still have to find future solutions for. There's certainly no shortage of topics to cover, so I'm going to keep this short. And with that, Rob, thank you so much for doing this together with us, and over to you.
Thank you, Alina. So we've really enjoyed working with you and CEPA over the last year and a half, 2 years, whatever. And thank you for joining us on this event. So let me introduce our two speakers, and then we'll just jump right into the program. Tyson Barker is the Senior Advisor, Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the U.S. State Department, and he specializes in transatlantic relations, international economic policy, NATO, U.S.-German relations, U.S.-Russia relations, and is involved in a lot of these issues that we're going to talk about today. So Tyson, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Second, Eva Meidel, who will be joining in just a few moments. She's a member of the European Parliament and a member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy. She's also been part of trade delegations to Japan and the US. She's also a substitute member on the Committee of Economic and Monetary Affairs and president of the European Movement International. So Eva has been called away in a meeting, but she should be joining us just momentarily. So I think we'll probably get started without her, and then she'll join us as we go along. So Alina, over to you.
Well, great. And Tyson, many thanks for being here with us. As we await for our European colleague to join, I thought maybe you could help kick us off. As I mentioned, we're approaching now the fourth meeting of the TTC in Sweden at the end of this month. If you had a wish list for what you want to get done, what would be your top three, let's say, as to what you'd like to see, after we're done with this TTC? And maybe as you answer that question, you could talk a little bit about kind of where you see the function of the TTC, given that we already had four meetings in terms of its accomplishments, and then what do you want to see get done at this fourth meeting?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks so much for the invitation from CEPA and from ITIF, two really valued stakeholders. As you both know, Rob and Alina, I am a covering stakeholder myself, having just joined government, but I really appreciate the valuable impact that you've had in shaping these discussions and what we can do for the past almost 2 years. So you talked, what's on the agenda at TTC4? Well, first of all, I think it's important to talk about why this location, why Luleå. And I think this really goes back to the kind of origin story of the TTC, the purpose of the TTC, which is really to highlight that the story of trade and technology and geopolitics of trade and technology isn't just about capitals. Citizens in both Europe and the United States are really playing a role in shaping these geopolitics in this kind of 21st century fit for purpose way, which Alina, you alluded to. So Luleå is not only almost at the Arctic, but it's at the cutting edge of the twin transitions. This is where Facebook, then now Meta, established one of its largest, I think its largest data center in Europe, which was zero net emissions at the time. This was about 10 years ago. It's also home to everything from green steel production to a Northvolt EV gigafactory. So this is really so emblematic of the kind of economies that both the European Union and the United States are looking to shape. So really great to have those 5 principles at Luleå at the end of the month. Rather than kind of getting into too much about what is going to be on the agenda and what the deliverables are going to be at TTC4, because I don't want to get ahead of our principals on this when they do negotiate there and discuss there, I want to talk a little bit about what's happened since TTC3. There's been kind of a lull in conversation about this, but there's actually been a lot going on. And just to highlight a couple of the things. Obviously, Ursula von der Leyen was in Washington on March 10th. We had the joint statement where the US and EU announced that they were actively negotiating a critical minerals agreement that would counting towards the clean vehicle tax exemption requirement under the IRA's Section 30D. This is very similar negotiation to what happened with Japan. And of course, we're hoping that that will happen sometime in the near future. That is something that they will often also discuss in Sweden. The US and EU also launched a clean energy incentives dialogue, which is looking to talk about how we're using industrial policy to both advance our green transitions, to make sure that these are durable for our societies given political changes, and also address questions around non-market economies and their practices. And I think we know this from that non-market economies for the United States and frankly for both sides is code for the PRC in this context. On semiconductors, we both have our CHIPS Acts. I know that Eva is going to speak to the EU CHIPS Acts. But just this last month, just actually at the end of March, the State Department launched its International Technology Security and Innovation Fund, which is looking to build initiatives with allies and partners like the EU to shore up secure, resilient supply chains in 2 specific areas, semiconductors and telco and ITC infrastructure. And on this, the Commerce Department's CHIPS program office actually did one of its first trips to Brussels to discuss how we can make sure that our industrial policies in this new emerging technology are complementary. And of course, we all know that there's a lot of investment on both sides of the Atlantic kind of covering this. ASML, Infineon, NXP, Zeiss, Trumpian-Optic on the European side. From the US side, Intel, Wolfspeed, Micron, IBM, and others. And we're investing in each other's economies and creating, enabled by these CHIPS Acts, creating a kind of strategic interdependence, which I think is also at the core of the TTC. There's a couple of last things. On artificial intelligence, we have this new administrative arrangement where we're trying to work together. This was announced in January, where we're trying to work together to kind of work on our research and development in specific areas. And we're working on a joint roadmap for trustworthy AI, that is reflective of the kind of risk topography laid out in the NIST risk management framework, but also what the AI Act is trying to do, and to make sure that how we understand risk is also reflected in Europe's regulation, because of course the Europeans are in a different stage in developing regulation and terms than the United States. But that has also continued. And the final thing I want to flag in this context, what's happened so far, is the Development Finance Corporation and the European Investment Bank signed a memorandum of understanding. This was announced at TTC3. It has now happened on April 13th. And that should enable us to really get down to the business of joint financing for trustworthy ICT and infrastructure projects. So it's not just about the ministerials. It's about what is happening in between, and there's a lot of action happening.
Tyson, can I just stick with you for a second? Then I'm going to pass it back over to Rob to get into it with Eva, who's joined us, of course. Thank you so much for being here, Eva, from the Parliament. Tyson, if we pan out a little bit, because you just went through a very long and very comprehensive list of the specific areas where TTC has made progress and will hopefully continue to make progress. But you alluded to the role of China, which sometimes is this elephant in the room in these discussions around technology and trade. So, are you finding that there's greater alignment between Europe and the U.S. on how to address China through the lens of competition in the space of technology? Or, there's no secret, right, that there's been a wedge between U.S. and Europe for a very long time. There's still a lot of debates happening within European countries as to what the policy and approach on China should be, not just in technology, but just broadly from a foreign policy, national security perspective. But have you seen this move towards convergence, alignment, whatever the term is, where the Europeans are starting to see China through the lens that the U.S. tends to see it, which is as a strategic competitor and a sort of pacing threat, if you will, or pacing challenge to the United States?
Yeah, I mean, both the United States and the European Union have very complex relationship with the PRC, with China. And I think you do see a lot of convergence here. And I think that the TTC has enabled a great deal of that convergence. If I just take a step back to where we were in 2020, the first dialogue on technology that the European Union launched with a great power was with the PRC. And that didn't go anywhere, if you look. And, now with this administration stepping up to the plate and saying, the European Union is a very significant actor in setting the global rulebook, not just on trade, but also on digital technology. We have come to build trust and lower barriers that were in existence in the recent past. And just to flag a couple of examples, if you look at the joint statements of the TTC for the first three, you see a lot of, I think, language that would imply China. It talks about forced labor in certain countries in production of solar panels. It talks about non-market economies. The joint statements. They talk about the use of social scoring by authoritarian states. These are all clearly implicit that they're talking about China, but as we've started to converge, you're seeing the PRC itself mentioned more in these statements. So we had the first mention of the PRC in a statement at TTC 3. And then if you look at the joint statement that von der Leyen and Biden had on March 10th, China is very, very present in the conversation around economic security and non-market practices. So I think that there is a good deal of convergence. And on both sides, you're seeing, the development of new tools to address it. And those tools being implied at times jointly, or at least in great communication and coordination with the other side.
Thanks, Tyson. I'm sure we'll come back to that topic. So Rob, back over to you.
Thanks, Alina. Well, I'm going to stay on that topic and go slightly out of order. So Eva, thank you so much for joining us. I've already done a fantastic introduction for you. It was an amazing introduction, so I won't need to go over it again.
I heard a little bit, actually. So I was trying to log in. Thank you.
But thank you for joining us. I wanted to build on Alina's question, because there was a lot of, I think, concern over President Macron's recent trip to China and some of what he said, particularly talking about strategic autonomy. And then obviously there's talk in Europe about this notion of digital sovereignty, which again, I think causes a lot of heartburn in the US, because what does that, does that mean that the US can't be part of the EU digital economy? There's certainly issues around focus on European cloud providers as opposed to allied cloud providers. There's focus on data flows and the like, digital services taxes. So where are we now with that? And I know there's obviously Europe is a lot of different countries with different voices, and then you have Brussels as well. But where are we with all of that? I know there was pushback somewhat against President Macron's statements and saying, no, there is a closer alliance. How do you see that all playing out right now?
First of all, very good to see you, Rob and Alina. Thanks a lot for including me in this conversation together with Tyson. Let me give you a little bit my thoughts on that important collaboration between the EU and the US, because I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I believe we do have our different strengths from which we can both benefit. Strengths that I believe they're very much rooted in those democratic traditions that we stand by, and also the commitment we have to economic competition. So when we are talking about building the so-called European strategic autonomy, I think it has to be not an either-or pursuit. European strategic autonomy should be increased simultaneously while strengthening and deepening our relationship with like-minded partners like the US. And this is why we should continue the work of the TTC, but also be able to shift our focus onto a broader international fora and cooperation like the OECD, the WTO, the G20, to better align democratic partners such as Japan, for example, in a more common and shared vision. Also, I remember probably the last time me and Tyson sat together in a panel was at the GlobSec discussion. I think Central and Eastern European voices are quite clear on the need for further enhancement of our transatlantic cooperation. Those voices should also be part of the voices that are heard, that are taken into consideration. When it comes to tech, to trade, and China, we have a unique perspective in a way. And this is a region in which China has attempted to exert its economic influence, a region that is, in a way, up and coming when it comes to tech, and also a region in the same time that has a long history of battling with Russian disinformation and influence. So there are many lessons to be learned there that could better shape and help this conversation around strategic autonomy.
So yeah, thank you. That you brought out, I thought, a very interesting point, issue, which is that voices in Europe are not always the same, and that Central and Eastern European voices have a somewhat unique perspective, given your own history, given the fact that you are up and coming. ITIF recently published a report called the Hamilton Index on Industrial Competitiveness, and we looked at data from the OECD on 7 advanced industries: autos, electronics, et cetera, et cetera. It was striking how much progress there was among the Eastern European countries from 1995 to 2018, and even how advanced some of these countries are. And a lot of people don't necessarily think about that. How do you see that all playing out? Because at least from this side of the Atlantic, when you think about Europe, you think Germany and France, Germany and France, Germany and France, and then Brussels. Do you see that changing? Do you see the Eastern European voices becoming a little more influential, a little more powerful?
This is one of the reasons why for me it was important to mention that there are different parts of Europe that are being vocal on the topic, and they have to be considered as well. I kind of feel that sometimes those voices, as much as you might see the country that exited the EU, which is the UK, you might have look at them as their own way of doing geopolitics and politics. But actually the UK, while it was still within the EU, it was very good at organizing the Central and Eastern European voices into a more common strategy, and having a voice that can be further amplified. This is why I have always been of the opinion that these countries have to try to cooperate more with each other, because very often their calls are seen as separate calls and separate pitches and separate, they don't talk all together. And this is why I mentioned when we were at a forum together with Tyson, I think it's an important forum that can gives the platform to unite some of these voices together and speak with one voice. But of course, it's not an initiative between member states, at least not a very concrete one. So them trying to be more united in their messages and in their goals and names when it comes to transatlantic collaboration can be very useful. And perhaps only then they can be seen as a more serious stakeholder in that discussion. Otherwise, I would agree. You would look to Germany and France and perhaps Brussels, not always. When it comes to regulation, that's where you definitely look at. But hopefully geopolitics and our geopolitical views could also dominate more the transatlantic discussions. And TTC is one place where this happens, I believe.
Thank you.
Eva, thank you so much for bringing up, I think, the role of the often overlooked countries when it comes to perspectives and technology in particular. We at CEPA, as you know, have been focusing on that part of Europe for a very long time because we think there's unique perspectives there. And I think as the center of gravity in Europe, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has been shifting eastward on conventional defense and security questions. There's no doubt about that. I think even in France, Germany, and Italy, there's no doubt about that. I think the big question is whether the center of gravity and other core issues is also going to shift east. And I think you're absolutely right that there's a real need, I think, for Americans and policymakers in Washington to understand the diversity of perspectives in Europe. And we have published several papers here at CEPA really outlining different perspectives on tech regulation in these countries, and to also continue to engage with Brussels, but also engage in a bilateral way to better understand what is happening on the ground in these countries that have a very different relationship with tech broadly defined. They have a very different relationship with American tech companies, and they understand the value of American foreign investment in their countries in a very profoundly different way than I think what you hear in France and in Germany and elsewhere. The more you can do to encourage these countries to speak with one voice, the better, because I think that is the most effective way to do this. And I would also add Ireland to that list as well, because obviously with the UK leaving the EU, that has left this huge vacuum on all of these issues. But Tyson, I want to transition to you on this point a little, because you brought up I think the very good deal from my perspective that the US got done with the Netherlands not that long ago on semiconductors and export controls. And I wanted to, because Eva mentioned that the TTC is a great format for where the diversity of perspectives does get heard, that even though it is a EU-US dialogue, there is a diversity of perspectives being heard there. I just want to get your thoughts on, panning out from the TTC a little bit. How do you, from your perch at state, kind of see the value of bilateral relationships in this context, and also multilateral relationships, right? Because the TTC is just one piece of many, many conversations that are happening at the OECD. We have the G7 coming out. There's a proposal that's been debated on data flows and how to secure data flows of the G7. So, if we take the TTC as kind of the middle ground there, but there's also below that the bilateral and above that the multilateral. So how do you square, managing all these different relationships, and where do you see the value of, I guess, the multilateral and the bilateral pieces?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and let me start with the export control piece, because as you correctly noted, the United States was in trilateral talks with Japan and the Netherlands on specific semiconductor export control coordination, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen in other areas, and in fact, it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened in some ways in the TTC itself. And one of the great let's say, achievements of the TTC in the run-up to TTC2 in the wake of Russia's stepped-up invasion, which is just a shock event in trade and technology, in the trade and technology order in Europe, in the Euro-Atlantic, just as it is in the security order. I mean, we have to recognize that this is really a game changer, but was to compress the time it took to impose technology export controls on Russia for months. I mean, if you think about it, getting starving Russia of critical semiconductors to literally weeks or days, and I mean, this remains one of the most effective costs imposed on Russia, because it forces them to take tough choices on where do they use their finite semiconductors. Do they use it in their drones, or do they use it in their civil aviation, or do they use it in the refrigerators that average Russians want to use, or cars that average Russians want to drive? So it's imposing a meaningful cost, and the TTC had a really important role to play in that. On your question of how does the United States engage, does it do it, in US-EU, multilateral, bilateral? I'm gonna in the multi-choice test, I'm gonna fill in circle D, all of the above, and I don't think that that's necessarily a problem. I mean, if you think about the nature of not just trade, but specifically technology, standard setting, the global rule book, these kind of questions. The policy approach needs to kind of reflect the technology itself, and it's developing extremely rapidly. So if you think about kind of technology ecosystems, the governance approach needs to also reflect ecosystems, and we need to look for allies and partners and venues where we can advance, a vision of governance that is most aligned with the United States. And sometimes that's bilaterally, for meaningful partners, which you flagged one with the Netherlands and Japan. Sometimes it's multilaterally in the OECD and ITIF, looking at the CBPR rules in the Indo-Pacific. And sometimes it's in fora with US-EU. And you see this all across the board. I mean, think about something like the Freedom Online Coalition, where there's great movement happening to advance digital rights, but that is a coalition, a plurilateral group that the EU is not a member to, but many member states are. If you look at the changes in the presidency of the EU, sometimes the EU presidencies, and I will say give a lot of credit to the Czech presidency for all the work it did. Sometimes it takes up the presidencies, including in Central Europe, take up TTC adjacent issues and give them lift. And one that the Czechs were very successful at is making a multi-stakeholder event to discuss and advance the Declaration on the Future of the Internet. I would be remiss in not flagging the fact that the successful US-European campaign to elect a Secretary General and Deputy Secretary General of the ITU also included the European candidate was from Lithuania. So Central Europe is playing a really important role here and will continue to, and the United States will engage bilaterally with the EU, at the OECD, at GPI, and of course with Indo-Pacific and global organizations as well. So all of the above on that.
You got a lot of work to do, Tyson. You and your colleagues at State. Rob?
So Eva, I want to build upon Tyson's comment there, because there is a lot of, I think there's certainly a lot of narrative and activity around thinking about how and should we, and to what extent should we align, if you will, internet rules and regulations, everything from, how we do the architecture all the way up to things like content and speech. And I know Europe has gone forward with the AI Act, something that ITIF has commented on. I guess I have a two-part question. Where do you see Europe going in this space on kind of the regulatory side? And then related to that, it's not at all clear to us that we have to have common regulations. We have to have interoperable systems, but we don't necessarily have to have the same regulations, in my view. And I don't think we can have the same regulations. Ideally, the Congress is going to pass a privacy bill. One can always hope. But I think this year may be possible. But that privacy bill doesn't have to be exact mirror of GDPR. It just has to be workable for interoperability. So I'd just be curious your thoughts on that and how your colleagues are thinking about these questions, and also in terms of interoperability with a US system, if you will.
Thank you. That's an area where I get very, very excited about, let's put it this way, because very often Brussels is seen as this a little bit isolated island that just does a regulation by itself without talking to the rest of the world. And this is to say, this does not mean that I believe that regulation that we have passed or that we are working on has to be mirrored elsewhere, but it indeed has to be interoperable. We need to talk to each other. And it also sometimes goes beyond legislation and regulation. It's also about this broader consultation with researchers, with stakeholders, the greater involvement in international standardization bodies, more in-depth exchanges, joint projects. And this is why when it comes to the TTC, again, I think it's a good platform where some of this conversation can be better structured and could have a particular and certain aim, whether it's about interoperability, setting standards, exchanging views. I think we have a lot to learn from one another. An example, I mean, just as the US is looking to implement its own vision for AI across federal agencies, it could definitely learn from the horizontal approach and also the enforcement provisions we have put in the AI Act, which we are finalizing here in the European Parliament. On the other hand, the EU could look to the US for the type of more bold and strategic thinking backed by substantial resources, because this is something that often lacks in some of our own proposals. And here, what I mean is if you look at the Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's Net Zero Industry Act. So in Europe, we are very good at setting targets, while in the US, you're setting budgets, so to say. So the Net Zero Industry Act does not itself come with a dedicated package of financial support like the IRA. And this is, where we could not just try to produce a legislation to compete, but we can learn and see what works and see whether it's applicable for our industries. So I think a little bit more proactivity rather than being reactive, and especially again going back to these two proposals, which I think are very important for our industries, but they come with with different goals and aims, even though initially it seems like they would deliver the same thing. I think if we are looking to lead in that area, in the space of clean tech, we definitely need to talk more to each other, to be on the same page from the beginning. And then there will be way less space for tension and maybe, so to say, compromises down the line, or in a way, also difficulties in the relationship that proposals and files such as the IRA have caused in a way between the transatlantic relationship.
Thank you.
So I thought maybe we could pan out a little bit and give a question that either of you can respond to, because there's no I think there's no hiding it. We all know that there are still some considerable tensions and challenges in the transatlantic relationship when it comes to the issues we're discussing here. One, of course, has to do with the fact that the EU has moved forward very quickly in regulation, whereas the US has done very little because of our internal politics here. Yet there's a huge amount of coordination happening between the two sides, which is, of course, a very positive development in the last several years. But there's still, I think, some obstacle and challenges ahead. We've been talking a lot about, opportunities where we can collaborate, when we can align, if not mirror each other, as Rob said. But, there are still underlying tensions. I was just in Berlin last week, and I was truly surprised that most of the conversation from many European colleagues was still very focused on, I would say, complaints about the Inflation Reduction Act here, which is it's been passed, it's done, and I think the administration has tried very hard to allay some of those concerns that Europeans have had. And so these tensions that have been building are also affecting, I think, our ability to work more closely together to align on standards around tech. So, I wanted to ask both of you, and, Tyson or Ava, feel free to jump in, whoever wants to go first. I guess, Tyson, to what extent do you still see these challenges as being kind of looming and large? And is the U.S. government, I know you're in the State Department, there's other agencies involved. I know that the state has constant conversations with European allies about all of these issues we've been talking about. Is there a desire for the United States to be more consulted, even as the EU makes its own domestic policies, right? Obviously, that's within the EU's prerogative, but would it be helpful if there was more of a consultative process? Maybe it already exists, and you can tell us more about that. And Ava, do you get the sense from your colleagues in the European Parliament that there's a desire to compromise more that may not always be in line with the vision that this commission set out at the very beginning? Because obviously we're going to have a different commission, next year, supposedly. Some familiar faces will probably remain, but kind of where do you see that heading? I think we're in such a positive place right now in the alliance, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine is such a shocking and tragic event, but it has served the function of bringing us so much closer together. So how do you, both of you, whoever wants to go first, how do you deal with those tensions?
If I could, Lena, just add one thing to that, your excellent question. I guess, there's a litany of complaints, and we've documented those, where I think there are unfair practices going on in the European Union that are discriminatory against American firms, particularly American tech firms. And I get the complaints or concerns with the IRA. So each side has these concerns, but I guess my question is, Tyson, how much do you think is there a negotiation there to sort of say, well, we can help you with the IRA, but you got to tone down the explicit things you hear from Brussels of digital sovereignty against the U.S., which I find frankly quite troubling.
Yeah, well, it's an excellent question, and thank you for addressing the big elephants in the room. I think that's useful. First, on the IRA, what I'm hearing both before I went into government and now being in government is that there has been a lot of hard work done to bring the two sides together and to move this from a frontline irritant to something where we're actually working constructively. And of course, one sign of that is the March 10th joint statement, where we talked about working towards a critical minerals agreement, which will allow for access to that piece, that slice of the tax exemption. Because I think that the big tension for Europe, or the big question mark for Europe, was regarding tax credits are related to electric vehicles. And then the other is what Treasury did at the beginning of the year, which is allow for leased vehicles assembled in Europe to have access, be eligible for the tax credit under Section 45W of the IRA as well. So already we're seeing a lot of convergence there. And from what I'm hearing in the conversations we're having with the Commission and also member states, it started to allay the concern. But as you and Rob both point out, having this very important conversation on the IRA, both in kind of, let's say, the TTC ecosystem has opened up, because we have so much trust, then the desirability, or shows that it's important to have conversations on a whole range of sensitive issues, including digital regulation, on things like regulation and rules, on things like cybersecurity certification for cloud computing. What are the sovereignty requirements? What are the justifications? Because there is a big difference between the US and countries like China when you're talking about credibility of cloud service providers. And I would just point to Ukraine in this regard, that part of the resilience of the Ukrainian economy under siege had to do with the fact that the Ukraine, its government systems switched from on-prem systems to cloud computing, aided by a lot of US and European companies that allowed to protect the vital functioning of Ukraine's government even at wartime. So, we need to have these conversations in a very sophisticated manner. On artificial intelligence, as mentioned, bringing in a risk topography that's interoperable is going to be quite important. And that's why we're having these conversations to develop the AI roadmap. And that should play a role in, our thinking together about how, Europe is moving forward on thinking about AI regulation. In other areas as well, fair use, usage fees. This is also something that we need to have an open conversation about. On the Data Act, very similar, to protect innovation, intellectual property, et cetera. And even on two pieces of legislation that have kind of already come or are coming into force, the DMA and DSA, there continues to be work together to bring about convergence and openness and interoperability. On DSA, we are optimistic that the EU can achieve access for American researchers to platform data within the scope of the law, so that our academics can also play a role in checking how content and algorithms are being addressed. And on DMA, there was the March 30th announcement in the TTC adjacent joint competition policy dialogue that the Department of Justice and FTC will send agency experts to assist in DMA implementation. And some people are asked questions about that, but I think that will help us bring a convergent view on how that law can be implemented and bring some US government expertise and know-how. So I think that these are all good signs.
Ava?
Sorry, I think both I and Rob were muted. So, I mean, my take on
You're muted again, Ava.
Yeah, my computer is more sensitive than I thought. Sorry about that. On the point on compromise, I mean, I think what would appeal more for a European perspective is about if the discussion is not so much framed around compromise, but is more about frame of having this dialogue and working towards a shared vision. But then when it comes to a shared vision, I think it would very much depend who you ask and how does the shared vision look like. We have seen how the debates have played around the CHIPS Act, the AI Act, and the negotiations. But also we've mentioned the comments of President Macron and his visit to China and the discussion that has followed. This means, and what I'm trying to say is that we in Europe are united around the same principles and the same values. And this is why I think when it comes to tech, we would find alignment among us that we would like to see tech being developed in line with our democratic principles. So we agree very often on the aim, but we disagree on the way to get there and what's the best way and what are the means to get us there. Of course, I and many of my colleagues would put the US in our shared vision camp of values. Our approaches are different, but the underlying concerns that keep us up at night are probably the same. This is why I think enhanced cooperation, it's more than important, but also understanding the different specificalities. This is why this diversity of perspective, it's key, because then I think both sides of the Atlantic will benefit from each other's strengths in a better way. Perhaps it will be more coherent. one could say Europe has a China policy, but then you have President Macron outlining something that is very different than the current China policy. We send different signals. Then you need to listen to what others say, as I said earlier. But perhaps particularly when it comes to pertinent topics like China, we need our renewed European policy. And I think the Commission President has in a way hinted slightly in that direction. As I said, we won't have the same approach, but I believe we have a shared digital future. And it's very important to align that shared vision and benefit from each other's approaches, despite that sometimes they could be very different. An example would be when US researchers will gain more access to data of a very large online platforms, thanks to a provision that we have put in the DSA, for example. And one can imagine similar gains in transparency, in safety, in trust when it comes to the AI Act once it is enforced. So on the EU side, there are some positive, I would like to say, spillover effects from the voluntary industry standards, like the public evaluation of AI systems, for example. But again, I do understand and very much aware of the different approaches.
Thank you so much. I think we need to wrap at this point. I just would add, I 100% agree, and I'm sure Alina does as well, about the importance of dialogue and open and honest and frank discussions, which is what the TTC is. I would just add, one of my frustrations over the years has been, at least from my experience, when we engage in dialogue, it's sort of usually on a panel, and so you get 5 minutes to 10 minutes to make a point, and somebody else makes another point. And you never really get an opportunity to go, well, wait a minute, what do you actually mean by that? What do you, as you said, Eva, what are your principles and goals? And are these things aligned or not? So I've felt for a long time that I do think there needs to be some kind of more civil society or think tank opportunities to dig into this a little bit more, because it's not just G to G, I think, that's going to help this. It's also these other voices. So that would be my plea. So Alina, over to you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Rob, for this partnership, and thank you so much, Eva and Tyson, for joining us. But Rob, you really set me up perfectly, which is that, as a think tank based in Washington and focusing on transatlantic issues, we're actually hoping to start kind of a track 1.5 dialogue exactly on these issues. So Tyson, Eva, I'm sure we'll be in touch with you specifically about that in the days ahead, because we've also recognized that we really need to have a safe space, so to say, where we can, engage a broader stakeholder group, that's beyond gov to gov, that's not just researchers talking to researchers or industry talking to industry. We really need to engage all of the stakeholders, because at the end of the day, the only way we're going to agree and implement a set of standards across all these very, very complex issue sets that we're talking about is if we have buy-in from all of these different groups. Governments can only do so much. Industry has to step in, and so does civil society and researchers. So more on that later, but for the time being, this was absolutely fascinating. I think there's a lot more that we could discuss based on what both of you said, but we'll end it here for now. Tyson,
just
thank
real
you very
quickly,
much.
Alina, I have a great idea for you. Is we all meet in the Azores. That's kind of halfway between each thing, and we'll have a nice time as well. But at least it's halfway between.
Hey, that I would second that idea. A track 1.5 in the Azores. We may have to stick with Washington or Brussels for the time being, but we'll work on it, Rob. It's a great idea. So again, on behalf of CEPA and ITIF as well, thank you both so much, and we'll be in touch, I'm sure, as the TTC takes place and afterwards, to get updates from both of you as to how we are progressing on some of these obstacles that we've mentioned. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.